Welcome everyone here this evening. We're glad you're able to join us as we continue our studies in the book of 1 Timothy. We are in the second chapter. If you'd like to open your Bibles to 1 Timothy chapter 2, we are continuing a study of Paul's instructions to the young preacher as he instructs him about the importance of opposing error, the importance of preaching the truth, and also some lessons for his own conduct and things he should teach the church. The first chapter involved a charge to warn people not to stray from the truth. In the second chapter, we have some instructions about prayer and instructions about the conduct of women. The first part of the chapter gave some universals, some things that are generally needed in general situations. And we talked about praying for all men and for all in authority, and salvation for all, and Jesus as the one mediator, and so on. The section we're in now, in chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, is discussing clothing, and specifically women. Now we'll see as we go along that instructions apply to men, not just to women. But here we're talking about, in this chapter, about women. So let's go ahead and read the verses again, and then we'll review some of the things we've already talked about. We'd like to read chapter 2, verses 9 and 10 for us, please. 1 Timothy 2, verses 9 and 10. Bill, please.
For which I suffer trouble as an evildoer.
Okay, Bill, are you in 1 Timothy 2, verses 9 and 10? First Timothy 2, verse 9 and 10.
In like manner also that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with priority and moderation, not with braided hair, or gold, or pearls, or costly clothing, but which is proper for women professing godliness and good works.
All right. So we spent a good bit of time last time, discussing some things we can learn from that, and then we were involved in extending this into various other scriptures that relate to the subject of clothing, and in particular being decent and covering ourselves adequately. What are some things we learned in our study last time about clothing from these verses? What are some lessons we can learn from these verses about clothing? Tell me one lesson we can learn. Terry.
That God cares how we dress.
All right, so first of all, it matters, doesn't it? Clothing is, people may say, well, that's just an external, which it is, but it reflects the heart. Just like many other things about the way we act, the things we say, the things we do. So our clothing reflects the attitude. Okay? What else have we learned from these verses? Well, what did he say about what was important, especially for women to emphasize in their clothing? Rick?
To show professing godliness.
Okay, so the thing that should especially be emphasized, he says, is godliness with good works. So that rather than overemphasizing outward appearance, even though that outward appearance is wrong, and we'll see that there's principles involved, the emphasis should be on being godly, so that what a woman wants to leave in the minds of those who know her is not that she is so overly impressive and vain in her appearance as she's concerned about being a godly person. Okay? Anything else that we learned in those verses? Okay, we also spent some time then talking about the terms that he uses in the New King James: modesty, propriety, and moderation. And we learned from those that a woman is to be concerned about her appearance, and specifically being properly dressed, and also that she's to have good judgment. This is not something that a person just automatically knows what's right to wear, especially as young women grow up. They may not realize the principles that they need to learn, that older women should teach them. And so it's important for them to learn to understand these, and that's what this is about. In chapter 2 here, women are to be taught the kind of clothing they're to wear, to have the judgment to recognize what's proper, what's not proper, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, and so on. So those are some things we talked about last time. And then we got into some other aspects of it as I said, enlarged into other areas. This passage talks about some things that are important, but there's also other passages that need to be emphasized, and that's what we want to talk about as we continue. We talked about in Matthew chapter 5, Proverbs chapter 6, and so on, the fact that the way a person dresses, particularly the way, in this case, a woman dresses, can cause or can tempt a man to have thoughts that he should not have. That we've learned that a man and his wife, have activities that they do that are perfectly proper between a husband and wife, but they would not be proper if it's people who are not married to one another. And so we should not have those kind of desires towards someone we're not married to. And not only that, we shouldn't do those kinds of things that would encourage those kind of desires or tempt another person. So we learned from Proverbs chapter 7 the danger of temptation, as it describes there a woman who is tempting a man by the things that she says, the things that she does, and in particular, by the way she dresses. So that the way a woman dresses can suggest thoughts to a man that are improper. The man should learn to resist temptation. We're not excusing a man who has improper thoughts, but it also does not excuse the woman who encourages those thoughts by the way that she acts, or in particular in this context, the way that she dresses. So let's look at some other passages that deal with this subject. And I'm not going to take the passages necessarily in the order that they are in the book, but we'll cover most everything, I hope, that's in the questions before we close. Look at me in 2 Samuel chapter 11. And let's look at it together, an example of a situation in which a man was tempted because of the appearance of a woman. 2 Samuel chapter 11 and verses 2 through 4. 2 Samuel chapter 11 and verses 2 through 4. And who'd like to read that for us, please? 2 Samuel 11, verses 2 through 4. Who'd like to read that, please? Noah, please.
It happened late one afternoon, when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house. He saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired about the woman. And one said, "Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Elon, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. Then she returned to her house.
All right, of course, the story goes on and discusses some of the consequences that occurred because of this event. As it describes, eventually they did commit adultery, and then which he conceived, and he had the husband killed so that he could marry Bathsheba, and so on. So we see a lot of complications, but it began with the fact that the woman was not properly covered in a place where a man, in this case the king, could see her. Now, if this kind of thing could tempt a man after God's own heart, like David's was, well, surely it can be a concern for any man. David was wrong, no excuse for what he did here at all, but Bathsheba was also involved because the way that she appeared and what place she could be seen by someone who was not her husband. Okay? Comments on the passage, discussion. One of the things that I'm hoping that we will understand from this, especially women, the young women in particular, the way you appear has an effect on a man which may not be the other way around. That is to say, men tend to be more easily affected by the appearance of a woman than a woman is affected by the appearance of a man, typically. And here we see these examples. And so it's important for women to understand that they can have this effect on a man and to be careful that they keep themselves covered and not act in such a way, or dress in such a way as to create these problems. Okay, any other comments on the passage? All right, let's look at some other passages then that relate to it. I want us to study some passages that relate to the topic of chastity. Look in Titus chapter 2 and verse 5 with me, please. Titus chapter 2 and verse 5. Now this word chastity is probably the word that we think of most like what we sometimes think of as modesty. We often today think of modesty in terms of covering ourselves adequately, so as not to be suggestive. And yet this word chaste is more close to that concept than the word, other words we've been studying. So let's read Titus chapter 2 and verse 5, where the young women are being taught some things by the older women. And here's what they're taught. Titus 2 and verse 5. We'd like to read it for us, please. Titus 2 verse 5. Rick, please.
To be discreet, chaste, own neighbors, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be blasphemed.
All right, now there's a number of important things that he's saying there that the older women should teach the younger women. But among other things, he would be taught to be discreet and to be chaste. So let's talk about both of those words, and with emphasis on the chaste. What does it mean to be discreet? What are we talking about when we talk about being discreet? If a woman has discretion, what does that mean, Frank?
Well, to be careful and not,
Okay.
to be careful not to present herself in a way that is unbecoming to other people.
Okay. So it's back to the idea from 1 Timothy 2 of good judgment. She's to have wisdom and discretion so that it's not just in clothing, but in general, so that she has a good conduct. It takes good judgment to know how to act properly. So that's to be taught by the older women. But then the word chaste has what idea? What did you find when you studied that word, chaste? This is question number 20. What did you find as the meaning of chaste? Terry?
It denotes purity.
Purity.
And, along with the idea of being self-controlled and
Okay. All right, purity, self-control. Let's look at 1 Peter chapter 3, and then we'll tie those passages together, because here's another passage that talks about the importance of women being chaste. 1 Peter chapter 3, and we have referred to this before, and will again, as it discusses women being in subjection, but in particular we looked last time at verses 3 and 4, where it talked about, again, not overemphasizing outward appearance, but rather emphasizing the attitude of heart and so on. But notice verse 2, 1 Peter 3 and verse 2, talks about the husband should observe in his wife her chaste conduct, accompanied by fear, and then goes on and shows that she should again not overemphasize outer appearance, but emphasize being godly and a gentle and quiet spirit and so on. So here's that word chaste again, specifically here in the context of clothing. That's what's being discussed here. So in this context, a woman is to dress in such a way that is to be chaste. Okay? So the one definition we've given was purity. Okay? But this purity in this word, and look it up in your dictionary, I hope you did in your study for tonight, emphasizes especially a woman who clothes herself adequately, does not dress in such a way as to be shameful. That's emphasized in this word, and women are to be taught that. This is something that needs to be learned, the discretion to do that properly. Okay? Other comments on the idea of being chaste, specifically as it applies to clothing? Frank?
Well, that would be, being chaste would be the opposite of what we had noticed earlier in Proverbs 7, verse 10.
Yes.
The dress of a prostitute.
Yes.
Which can, as you said earlier, can cause a man to stumble.
Yes.
Spiritually, stumble into lasciviousness.
Yes. So the Bible approaches it both positively and negatively. Don't do this, but do this. Be chaste, but do not be, in the next term, lascivious or licentious. Now these are not words that Unfortunately, these are not words that are not commonly used today. Even the word chaste, you hardly ever hear that today. It used to be a much more common word. As our society drifts away from the Bible, some of these concepts are even more difficult to understand. So let's look at the opposite of chastity, which is lasciviousness or licentiousness, and let's look at some passages there. Look at Mark chapter 7, verses 20 through 23, and the other passages are very similar to this, which simply lists various sins and says, among other things, that we should not be lascivious or licentious or lewd, depending on your translation. But let's look at it and read it. Mark chapter 7, verses 20 through 23. Who'd like to read that for us, please? Mark 7, verses 20 through 23. Somebody read that for us, please. Mark 7, verses 20 through 23. Bill, please.
And he said, what comes out of a man that defiles a man? For from within, out of the heart of men, proceed evil thoughts, adulterers, fornications, murders, thieves, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lewdness, and evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within and defile a man.
All right, so here Jesus lists a number of things that come from out the heart and defile the man. Now again, these are outward acts, but they start in the heart, and that's the point, and that's what we're emphasizing with regard to clothing. But notice in verse 21, various sexual aspects, including adultery, fornication, and so on. But as we've emphasized, it isn't just the physical act of fornication or adultery, it's the things that might lead up to it, that the Bible also forbids. And notice evil thoughts. So the thoughts that a person might have in his mind, again, that would encourage this kind of thing, even those thoughts are to be avoided. And then notice in verse 22, the New King James said lewdness, and other translations would be lasciviousness or licentiousness. But it's not words we use very often, so let's define them. What is meant by lewd or lascivious or licentious? What do those words mean? Someone define those, and you look them up in an English dictionary, they'll tell you what they mean. What do they mean? Someone define those words for us. Steve.
Inclined to lustfulness.
All right. So this is the concept of something that inclines towards lustfulness, something we would say sexually suggestive. That's what these words mean. So this is the opposite of being chaste. Rather than being sexually suggestive, people should dress in a way that is chaste. Now this passage isn't talking specifically about women, but it's general, which would apply to the men as well. Men also should not dress in such a way as to be suggestive or lewd. Okay? Other comments or definitions on this word, this term, lascivious or lewd or what have you. Anybody else? Frank.
Another word that is used here is coveting. And in one of the Ten Commandments is, thou shalt not covet your neighbor's wife.
Right.
Which is lust.
Exactly. And so we often think of covetousness in regard to material possessions, but sometimes it may be coveting another man's wife, desire a strong lust to desire to do or to see things that you should not do with a person you're not married to. All right. Daryl.
On the word licentiousness, I'm still trying to figure out how to say this, so I may stumble a bit. You see that similarity with the word license. With driver's license, that gives you permission to drive a car on public roads. And part of the idea of licentiousness is assuming that you have a license, permission, authority, whatever you want to call that, to do things that in fact you don't. That is licentiousness, to assume that, well, you know, there's certain ways God wants us to behave, certain ways God doesn't want us to behave.
Okay.
And licentiousness is to assume you have license, authority to do something that God really hasn't given you authority to do because you're not in that marriage relationship.
Okay. And in particular, the emphasis here is sexual. That's the emphasis in the word, is sexual permissiveness, which is not right unless you're married to one another. Okay? So the application in our study has to do with clothing. clothing that is not does not properly cover is suggested. And again, we need to learn that. Young women in particular need to understand that they can affect a man in a way that they shouldn't. It's just not proper to do that. Okay, Daryl.
Yeah, on that point, that young ladies need to understand how it affects a man. I'm sure that is, to some degree, still a problem, but I think today things have changed, and I think today young ladies know exactly how it affects a man. And they dress in such ways or send pictures in such ways because they know how it affects a man. And that's just out of bounds of what God expects of either gender.
Well, I suppose we could get into a discussion as to how commonly women understand and don't understand. And I suspect that women in the world, you're probably right, that they do tend to understand. But I'm not convinced that young women who've been raised in godly homes maybe have the understanding, maybe more so than they used to, but I'm not sure they have that understanding unless the older women or someone sits down and explains to them what's involved. Go ahead, Daryl.
With some kids, that's right, and especially I would say with kids that have been homeschooled. Kids in public schools, it is all around them.
Okay.
They know.
They know that's the way people dress. The question is, do they know the effect it's having on other people? That's really my point. In any case, whether they know or not, they need to know. And it's the responsibility of parents. And Timothy is a gospel preacher. He's being taught to teach that. Older women are to teach it. It's our responsibility to make sure people understand the principles that are involved. Back to 1 Timothy chapter 2. All right, we've looked at several principles that are important in the context of our discussion. But do you have any other comments or discussion? I have another area I want us to look at. And this one is something that people, I think, are not really clear on what the Bible says. Look at me in Genesis chapter 3. With Adam and Eve in the garden. We remember that when they were created, they were naked, and it was just the two of them. They didn't see any problem with it until they committed the first sin. And when they committed the sin, then there was a problem with regard to nakedness. You need to understand the principles involved. There are several important points. So let's read Genesis 3, verses 7 through 11. Who'd like to read chapter 3, verses 7 through 11 for us, please? Genesis chapter 3 and verses 7 through 11. Frank, please.
This is the English Standard Version.
Okay.
Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. And they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. But the Lord God called to the man and said to him, "Where are you?" And he said, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself." He said, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten of the tree of which I commanded you not to eat?"
Okay, and then skip down and read, if you would, please, Frank, verse 21.
And the Lord God made for Adam and his wife garments of skins and clothed them.
All right. So when they committed the first sin, eating the forbidden fruit, they realized they were naked. Now, that word naked in our society often we think, has to do with not wearing any clothes at all. But the context here shows us that that's not really the biblical use of it. There's much more to it in the Bible. So what are some things we can learn from the example? Tell me something you learned from this story in which Adam and Eve, after they'd eaten the forbidden fruit, they realized they were naked, and what they did about it. What can we learn? Tell me something you learned from the story. Terry.
They were naked while they were nude, and they were considered naked after they made partial clothing.
Okay. That's an important point. Notice what it says. It says, verse 7, their eyes were opened, they knew they were naked. Then they put some clothes on, tried to make some clothes. And when God came, they hid themselves. And verse 10, Adam said, I was afraid because I was naked. So he's got some clothes on now, but he's still naked. And God agreed. God didn't argue with him. He said, who told you that you were naked? So having clothing on, if it's not enough clothing, is still nakedness in the Bible. Brian.
Well, this is just proof that man doesn't set the standard for what nakedness is. This is God. He provides them a garment that makes them no longer naked.
Okay. All right, so first of all, again, we have another passage that very plainly shows that God cares about our need to cover ourselves. It matters. Okay? And that in order to deal with the problem of nakedness, we wear clothing. And it must be adequate clothing. Otherwise, we're still naked, even though we may be wearing some clothes. All right? Anything else we learned here? Okay, let me emphasize a couple other points. Again, insufficient clothing is still nakedness. And it's a shame. Now, we understood that, but I want us to understand that. It is shameful if we don't cover ourselves adequately. It's always been shameful ever since the first sin was committed. Old Testament, New Testament, and there's some scriptures in the New Testament as well as the Old, that it's still shameful if we're not properly clothed. Okay? So we have that lesson. Then we also have the lesson. Well, maybe I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. All right. There is one other lesson I want to emphasize. Did God just talk about the woman's clothing here? He talked about the man too, didn't he? Both of them were to be clothed. And what did God do about that? They weren't clothed adequately. What did he do, Terry?
Made tunics.
Okay.
And
And
covered both of them.
yes, and they both were to wear tunics. Now, whatever that covered, it was the same thing for the man as for the woman. Sometimes we seem to have the idea that, well, a man doesn't need to wear as much as a woman. But God was just as concerned about the man as the woman, and what he made for the one was what he made for the other. And I'm not saying that we should wear the same clothes, but they cover the same amount. So it isn't just women that need to be concerned about what we're discussing here. It's the men that need to be concerned about it as well. Okay? Other comments on Genesis 3? All right, now let's look at some other applications of it. If nakedness is a shame, and it is, always has been, Old Testament, it's a shame, New Testament, it's a shame, then the Old Testament can even help us understand, Genesis 3, other passages can help us understand what nakedness is and what we need to cover in order to avoid nakedness. So there's some passages in the book of Exodus that talk about it. And I want us to look at Exodus chapter 28 in particular, and verses 41 through 43. Passage in Exodus 20 teaches us that we should be covered regardless of our activity. It isn't just that it's okay to be uncovered in some activities, but you have to be careful in other activities. We always need to be careful when we're around people that we're not married to. In Exodus 28, verse 41 through 43, we have a specific example that I think gives us a very specific understanding of the problem of nakedness and what we need to do about it. Exodus 28, verse 41 through 43. Who'd like to read it for us, please? Exodus 28, verse 41 through 43. Tim.
So you shall put them on Aaron your brother and on his sons with him. You shall anoint them, consecrate them, and sanctify them, that they may minister to me as priests. And you shall make for them linen trousers to cover the nakedness. They shall reach from the waist to the thighs. They shall be on Aaron and on his sons when they come into the tabernacle of meeting, or when they come near the altar to minister in the holy place, that they do not incur iniquity and die. It shall be a statute forever to him and his descendants after him.
All right, so talking here about the priests and what they wear in their duties, but it's also talking about nakedness. In verse 42, in order to cover their nakedness, What were they supposed to do? What does he tell them to do in order to deal with the problem of nakedness?
Make clothing.
Make clothing. And how does he describe the clothing? What does he tell us about it? What does it cover?
From the hips to the thighs.
From the hips to the thighs, depending on your translation. He calls them trousers, depending again on your translation. Trousers. From the, yours said hips to the thighs. This one says from the waist to the thighs. Some say from the loins to the thighs. Okay? So if nakedness is shameful, and nakedness, avoiding nakedness requires covering from the waist to the thighs, then that to me means some very important lessons. That from to expression is an expression that we might think, well, maybe it just means cover part of the thighs, cover part of your waist. Maybe just have some of it covered. I want to look at some passages that talk about this expression from to in a number of other passages, other contexts where the expression is used. And there's just a few of the many that we could talk about. So let's look at them. Leviticus 13, verses 12 and 13, talks about a person who had leprosy from his head to his foot. Well, would that mean did his head have leprosy? That's what that means, right? Did his feet have leprosy? Yeah, and everything in between. From the head to the foot. Number 6 talks about the Nazarite. Had the Nazarite vow, could not have anything of grapes. It said nothing from the grape, from the seed to the skin. Well, did that mean they should not eat the seeds? Yep. Does it mean they should not eat the skin? Yep. Should they not eat anything in between? Yeah, that's what that means. From to means whatever you're talking about, this is included, that's included, and everything in between is included. Okay? David's son Absalom had no blemish from foot to head. Did he have blemish in his foot? No. Blemish in his head? No. No blemish from foot to head. We just recently studied the book of Esther in Sunday morning class. They sent messages to all the provinces from India to Ethiopia. The provinces were the message sent to India? Yeah. Ethiopia? Yeah. Everything in between? Yeah. Job had boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. Boils on his foot? Yeah. Crown of his head? Yeah. Everything in between? Yeah. That's what that means. And so on we can go. Now, Exodus 28:42. To avoid nakedness, we cover the naked flesh from the loins to the thighs. Should the loins be covered? Yeah. Should the thighs be covered? Yeah. And everything in between. Now, if we don't do that, that's nakedness. And it's shameful. Well, think about that. I'm not sure how many of us understand that concept, or at least have been introduced to it. But here's a passage that helps us understand what it means to avoid nakedness. And not only is this true, just you put on something and say, well, it comes down to my knees, so you can't see my thighs, so I'm okay. But then sometimes we start moving around, and we bend over, or we stoop, or we sit down, and we cross our legs. And now people can see our thighs. Well, that's nakedness. And that's a shame. So there's a lot to be thought about here. The Bible defines the importance. Our society just has, and to some extent back to Daryl's point, our society has gotten so far away from the biblical concept of decency and chastity and purity and avoiding lewdness and nakedness. We need to think seriously about some of these things. All right, questions, comments, discussion? Terry.
In Isaiah chapter 47, when the humiliation of Babylon is being spoken of here, verses 2 and 3, it says, take the millstones, grind the flour, put off your veil, strip off your robe, uncover your legs, pass through the rivers. Your nakedness shall be uncovered, and your disgrace shall be seen. God puts that in a very clear picture of how he will disgrace somebody who's done what's wrong, and therefore it's a disgrace to us when we choose to do it.
So again, nakedness is a disgrace. It's a shame, according to the Scriptures. All right. Well, let's kind of wrap up this topic. I want to encourage us to think of it in looking in a mirror. Try to evaluate the way you dress. A lot of us have these full-length mirrors. Picture yourself standing in front of the mirror and applying the principles we've been studying to the way you dress. And so ask yourself questions like this. Am I covered so as to avoid tempting others? Is what I wear too low? Too short? Too tight? And in particular, what shows when I start to move around? Not just when I stand there, but what happens when I bend or when I lift my arms up? What can people see then? That maybe they couldn't see before, but now they can. Or put a chair in front of that mirror. Sit down in the chair, face to the mirror, and sit like you often may sit when other people are around. What happens when you sit with your legs crossed in front of that? What do you see then? Do you see things that you really shouldn't show, that other people shouldn't be allowed to see? That's what happens far too often. Am I concerned primarily about fashion, being in style? Or am I more concerned about being godly? And what might influence be? Will I influence other people to be godly? And if Jesus was with me, if I knew Jesus was there, would I want to dress like this? Or I say, well, maybe I need to put something more on if Jesus is going to be there. And what about the day of judgment? Would I like to be dressed like this at the day of judgment? When I stand before Jesus Christ to have my eternal destiny determined? Those are some questions that I hope we'll all think about as regards our clothing, how we dress, and the things that we wear. Other comments anybody has on the subject of clothing before we get back to 1 Timothy chapter 2? Terry.
In Revelation chapter 19, the idea of the bride of Christ in verses 7 and 8, that his bride made herself ready. It was granted to her to clothe herself with fine linen, bright and pure, with fine linen is the righteous deeds of the saints. But the idea of that we are the bride of Christ, and how we present ourselves as his bride, and the fact that even in this idea, how she was dressed, how this bride is dressed to present herself before Christ was an important thing. And we should not only see this as an idea of how we interact with other people, but how is Christ looking at his bride, and how is that bride dressed?
Okay, and that's a good point. Of course, we can't think of ourselves literally as married to Christ, but we are spiritually his bride. If you wanted to make a favorable impression on a man who was like Jesus Christ, ought to be, how would you dress? Another passage along that line is 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 2, where Paul said, I have betrothed you to one husband, and I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ. There's that word chaste again. If one is going to have a proper relationship with Christ, he must be chaste. Well, that helps us understand that word chaste. The way you would dress if you were around Jesus Christ. That's the way we should dress in general. All right. Questions, comments before we close tonight? Frank.
Comment about that reading brings to mind, and you had mentioned earlier, sometimes people think that their activity gives them license to dress in immodest way. But so many times in a wedding, the bride's young ladies that are brides dressed in a wedding gown that is way too revealing and immodest. And so the older ladies need to help younger ladies think about the design of their wedding dress so that it's not revealing.
Absolutely. In fact, that amazes me that here stands a young woman promising to keep herself only to this one man for life. And here she is wearing things that she wouldn't even wear otherwise in normal circumstances. And yet she'll do it on her wedding day. It's still shameful because it isn't chaste. It isn't modest. It isn't decent. All right, not an easy subject. I understand that.